Are we not engaging with the movement in the ways that really need to happen?
I can speak best to the context of the US because that's where I'm working, but I can tell you that around questions of economic and social rights, young people do show up in droves, and there are progressive faith-based people that show up, and the housing groups show up, and groups working on racial justice show up. Even some groups working on environment, as they see the community development issues intersex, are beginning to show up, but the women's groups don't show up in the same way. And part of the frustration for me is it that people just can't get on board if it's an intersectional issue? You have to reach across to some of these other issues, because in some ways the women's movement has been one of the most powerful, at least in our history, and the ESR movement is going to have a very hard time succeeding without the women's movement being a significant integrated ally, and I am not seeing it.
One of the possibilities of this gap is also around language, which is that when we talk about the body in the way we do, the language around sexual and reproductive rights, in essence, has been created by many of the women in this room. The language around economic rights, well, not so much rights, but around economics, is a language that is still extremely difficult for many of us to penetrate.
If this is true, that the salience of economic and social rights and economic policies is kind of nowhere near as strong as sexual and reproductive rights, has this anything to do with inequality between women? I think one of the things we've neglected is the growth of inequality between women. And it's something that's quite hard to track because our statistical systems aren't geared up to doing that, especially in economies where most people don't work in a formal economy. But I have this horrible feeling that the kind of progress that insofar as we've seen any progress, in the last 20 years, and I think we have in certain ways, it's been, a lot of the economic side of it has been very concentrated in women, for women like us, for women like most of us here who have an education, who have a job with an NGO or in the academy or maybe with government, a regular paid job. It's women like us, and so maybe that have gained most, and maybe we don't feel quite in our guts the issues about the rights to housing and the rights to food as women who are not present in this room because they don't find it so easy to travel to New York. On the language of economics, yes, it can be an extremely disempowering language, and some of us think, maybe, it's not so accidental. It's either very difficult to understand, or it's a language that boxes you in and leads to the conclusion there is no alternative. Many of us in feminist economics have been working on popular education in economics. How do you kind of reconstruct a different understanding of how economies work?
We are speaking here about economic justice, and I hear we are looking for new alliances. But how come that I don't hear an alliances with the feminists working in the trade unions?
I don't think there'd be anybody in this room who would disagree. I would just say, however, that although there have been some very important changes in the trade unions and in the structure and composition of trade unions, some of it brought on perforce by what globalization has been doing to labor and labor markets. At the same time, we cannot forget that more and more both women and men are actually outside the unions. They're working outside unions. They don't have a hope in hell of being a union member in their working lifetime. And the challenge for the unions, as much as it is for us, is to see where the connection and the continuum between production and reproduction, the care economy, and how you organize for the care economy and what work needs to happen in terms of the workplace come together in the community, and what kinds of organizations work on those.
When we do panels like these and stuff, perforce as part of delving more deeply into analytical frameworks, we have them separate. We sort of do the body and then we're doing the economy. But I think the question for us to ask is, within periods of such economic disenfranchisement, how does one maintain, or how do we think about the maintenance of bodily integrity of men and women, of sexual rights, within a context of such incredible economic disempowerment?
So we're here to talk a little bit about ourselves, about how do we understand this thing that we've been calling all day the movement. And if we can really call the movement. And I think the previous discussion made clear that we are having a harder time every time that we try to understand when we say movement, who are we talking about? So I think if we look at the movement that we were seeing in Beijing, the diversity and the emerging diversity was very obvious. But if we look at the movement now, many of those voices that were starting to emerge in the global level, like, for example, the indigenous women's movement, are now a globalized movement as well, and are producing a lot of theory and thinking and also practice, challenge us, for example, our understanding of human rights when we talk about collectivity. So the movement has changed because there are so many actors that are using human rights language but are not necessarily coming to the UN or not even engaged with the UN because they don't think that's where change is going to happen.
I think the questions are these. Where is the power of our movement in the light of the backlash? Where is the hope, given what is going on at CSW? And the third question that came from the panel on the economy, what do we need to do to mobilize more efficiently on issues of economics and militarization? I'm basically an optimist, and I have to find some hope. The reason I keep coming back to New York is because this is where I find the hope. I find the hope in being here, among friends, among people that I've known for 20 years, 15 years, new people that I've just met, young women, and that reminds me that in spite of all the one step forward, two steps backwards, the movement continues. The movement continues. It's resilient. It'll keep bouncing back. And the very challenges that we face is what is going to give us the strength. So I always have hope, particularly because I don't have to cross the street to the UN, which I find so discouraging. But I really am glad that it's there because it's a wonderful place for young women. So let me say, please, young women, go there. Don't expect people of my age and generation to accompany you.
Now, this morning, Radhika assured us that this is a safe space and we are all part of the same family. So we are going to have a frank conversation. Over the years, one of the things we've been so successful at as a women's movement is building an infrastructure and an architecture for the women's movement all over the world. We have research institutions, we have international think tanks, we have service delivery programs, we have resource centers, we have a whole range of processes and spaces that support our agency at so many different levels. But this infrastructure and architecture has become problematic in some instances. Sometimes we don't have the right kind of leadership. Sometimes we don't have the right kind of alignment. Sometimes we use these spaces not to empower the women of the world we claim to be supporting, but to disempower. Maybe because over the years we've been forced into building these institutions and structures which have forced us to work in certain ways, projectizing our work, structuring our work, speaking the language of funders and a whole range of things. Some of us seem to have lost touch with what it means to be there for another woman. Most of the women's organizations in the movement are on life support. Just one tug at a cord somewhere or one flick of the switch and the organization is gone. Maybe we need to work differently as a women's movement. Maybe we don't need that many networks or that many organizations. Have we thought of more collaborations? Have we thought of mergers? Maybe that is one strategy we can put in place to tackle the sustainability issue and the leadership issue and the alignment issue. Thank you.